The history of the most iconic fashion partnership in cinema was almost never written. Not because talent was missing, not because timing was wrong, but because of a single morning in Paris, 1953, when a young woman walked through a door she was never supposed to enter, and a man looked at her and saw the wrong name. Hubert de Givenchy had been awake since 5 o'clock that morning. His atelier on Avenue George V was already humming with controlled urgency by the time the assistants arrived. Steam rising from pressing irons, bolts of silk and Duchess satin stacked along the walls like monuments to obsession. He was 26 years old, and he had already built something extraordinary from almost nothing. A house of couture that whispered rather than shouted, that believed elegance was a form of restraint. That morning, however, restraint was the last thing on his mind, because Katharine Hepburn was coming, the Katharine Hepburn. 4 Academy Award nominations, the most commanding presence in American cinema, and she needed a wardrobe for her next film. Givenchy had been preparing for this meeting for weeks. He had selected pieces he believed she would love. He had imagined the conversation, the collaboration, the way her name attached to his work would change everything. His assistants moved around him in precise orbit, adjusting, pressing, arranging. The atelier held its breath. And then the doorbell rang. The young woman who entered was not who anyone expected. She was tall and thin, in a way that spoke less of fashion and more of something endured. She wore a simple dress, almost aggressively modest by Paris standards, and a straw hat with a small card tucked into the band. On the card, in her own handwriting, she had written the letters HH. She smiled at the assistant, who opened the door with a warmth that seemed almost out of place in a couture house. Too human, too unguarded, too real. She said her name, Audrey Hepburn. Givenchy heard it from across the room and felt, in his own later words, a small cold drop of disappointment land somewhere behind his sternum. He had been expecting the other Hepburn, the famous one, the one whose name could open doors across an entire industry. Audrey Hepburn was, at that moment, a woman on the edge of something. Roman Holiday had not yet been released. Her Oscar had not yet been given. Her face had not yet been reproduced on a million magazine covers. She was, to Givenchy's eye, a girl in a straw hat with a borrowed name, and an appointment that had been made under what felt like false pretenses. He was polite. He was always polite. But he told her the truth directly, with the particular cruelty of the genuinely busy. He was deep in the final stages of a new collection. His time was impossible. He could not possibly dress her for this film. He was sorry. He hoped she understood. Most people would have understood. Most people in that room, watching this exchange, assumed the girl in the straw hat would offer a gracious word, a small, apologetic smile, and leave. The door was right there. Paris was right outside. She could disappear into it, and Givenchy would return to his silk and his pressing irons and his waiting Katharine Hepburn fantasy, and none of this would ever matter. But here is what Givenchy did not know about the girl standing in his atelier. He did not know about the winter of 1944, when she was 15 years old and the Germans had cut off food supplies to the Netherlands, and her weight had dropped to 90 pounds. He did not know that she had watched her neighbors collapse in the streets from hunger, that her family had eaten tulip bulbs and grass pulled from frozen earth to survive another day. He did not know that she had already, by the age of 16, lost more than most people lose in an entire lifetime. Her childhood, her ballet dreams, her father who had simply walked out one morning and never returned. The version of the world where safety was possible. He did not know that the girl standing before him had learned something in those years that could not be taught in any atelier, any academy, any film studio. She had learned that the only doors that matter are the ones you refuse to walk away from. She did not leave. She looked at Givenchy with those eyes, those extraordinary, disproportionate, ancient eyes that the camera would one day spend decades trying to understand. And she asked a single quiet question. She asked if she might simply look at what he had already made. Just look. She was not asking him to dress her. She was not making a demand or a negotiation. She was asking for 5 minutes inside the work of a man she genuinely admired, and there was something in the asking that made it almost impossible to refuse, without feeling like a smaller person than you wanted to be. Givenchy later could never fully explain why he said yes. He said it was a weakness. He said it was curiosity. He said it was the eyes. Whatever it was, he nodded, and Audrey Hepburn walked into the heart of his collection. What happened in the next few minutes has been described by the people who were present in terms that sound almost theatrical, almost too perfectly arranged for the story they are inside. But the accounts are consistent, and consistency in memory is its own kind of truth. Audrey moved through the racks of finished pieces slowly, with a quality of attention that stilled the room around her. She was not browsing, she was reading. Each garment seemed to tell her something, and she received the information with a seriousness that made the assistants, who had seen every kind of client walk through those doors, stop what they were doing and watch. She paused at a black cocktail dress. She touched the fabric with the very tips of her fingers, the way you touch something you are trying to understand rather than simply feel. She lifted it from the rack. She asked very softly if she might try it on. There are moments that exist in two registers simultaneously: the ordinary surface of events and the seismic shift happening underneath. What Givenchy's atelier witnessed when Audrey emerged from the fitting room was both at once. The dress had been made for his collection, for the abstract ideal of a woman his imagination had constructed. But when Audrey stepped into the room wearing it, something corrected itself, as if the dress had been waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. She stood still. She did not perform the moment. She simply occupied it, fully, quietly, with a presence that had nothing to do with the conventions of beauty and everything to do with the specific gravity of a person who has survived something and come out the other side not hardened, but more completely themselves. The room stopped. The pressing irons went cold. The assistants who had been weaving through the space with the focused purposefulness of people who work in fashion, who have seen everything and are moved by very little, stood motionless. Givenchy turned from the work he had returned to and looked at the girl in his dress and understood, in the way that certain understandings arrive, not gradually but all at once, like a key turning in a lock, that he had been wrong. Not about the appointment, not about the name, not about the confusion. Wrong about what mattered. The dress was not his anymore. It had never been more fully itself than it was in this moment, on this woman, in this light. He had spent years constructing an idea of elegance, the belief that true beauty was a kind of subtraction, a removal of everything unnecessary until only the essential remained. And here was his theory walking toward him in a straw hat and 90 pounds of wartime survival, and those eyes that had already seen things his imagination could not reach. He felt in his own later account something close to shame, not the shame of error, but the deeper shame of having almost missed something irreplaceable through the ordinary arrogance of being busy. What Givenchy did not know, and what he spent the next 40 years slowly understanding, was that the quality he saw in Audrey that morning, that particular fusion of fragility and immovability, that stillness that was not emptiness, but its opposite, was not a talent. It was not a gift in the conventional sense. It was the residue of loss. She had learned to be still because she had spent years in a world where stillness meant survival. She had learned to be present because she had lived through seasons when the present moment was all there was. She had learned that surfaces were meaningless because she had watched beautiful things be destroyed and ugly things endure, and understood that the only architecture that holds is the one built inside a person. Givenchy asked her to stay. He asked if he could dress her for the film. Audrey said yes in the way she said most things, quietly without excess, with a warmth that was not performance but simply the way she existed in rooms. They had dinner that evening, the two of them, at a small restaurant near the atelier. They talked for hours. They discovered in each other a shared understanding of restraint as a form of power, of silence as a form of speech, of elegance not as a costume, but as a commitment to the truth of one's own presence. Givenchy said later that he felt, that evening, as if he had been speaking a language he invented alone, and had suddenly found someone who spoke it fluently, someone who had arrived at the same conclusions through entirely different suffering. The collaboration that began in that atelier in 1953 would define both of their legacies in ways neither could have anticipated. The black dress she wore in Breakfast at Tiffany's, the cream gown in Sabrina, the silhouettes that redefined what women understood about their own bodies, about the difference between dressing to be seen and dressing to be. Givenchy said repeatedly, across decades of interviews, that everything he understood about his own work he learned in the years of dressing Audrey Hepburn. He said she taught him that the most powerful garment was the one that disappeared, that allowed the person wearing it to be entirely visible. He said she was not his muse. He said she was his conscience. When Audrey Hepburn died in January of 1993, Givenchy did not make a public statement for several days. When he finally spoke, he said very little. He said that there are people who pass through a life and leave it larger than they found it, and that Audrey was one of those people, and that he had been lucky enough to stand close to her for 40 years, and that he was not sure he had ever fully deserved it. The dress she had worn that first afternoon in his atelier, the one she had lifted from the rack with her fingertips and asked permission to try on, the one that had stopped a room full of professionals in their tracks. He had kept it all those years. He never explained why. He never needed to. Some things are kept not because they are valuable, but because they are true, because they are evidence of the moment a door opened that was supposed to remain closed, because they are proof that 5 minutes of stillness and one quiet question can alter the entire course of two lives and everything that flows downstream from them into the world. The next time you watch Audrey Hepburn on screen, watch what she does when nothing is happening. Watch the moments between words. Watch what her hands do when she has been given nothing to do with them. What you are seeing is not acting. What you are seeing is a woman who learned, in the hardest school that history has ever run, that the most powerful thing a person can do is simply refuse to disappear. Givenchy understood this the moment she walked out of his fitting room in a dress she had no right to try on, in an atelier she should have left, at a meeting that had been arranged for someone else entirely. He understood it because he saw for the first time what it looked like when everything unnecessary had been removed. What remained was extraordinary. What remains extraordinary still. So here is the question we're sitting with. Has anyone ever tried to dismiss you based on the wrong assumptions? Opened a door in your face before you could speak? And did you stay anyway? Write it in the comments. Because the most important moments in any life are the ones where you choose not to walk away.